Okay, hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So, now that we've gone over the basics of analysis, I want to get a little more specific this week, and we're going to talk about a particular type or style of analysis, the process analysis. So, we are pretty familiar with this as a general concept. We can consider a lot of things to be sort of different forms of process analysis. Basically, this is simply a technique that allows us to explain the steps or the sequence of any process or complex action. That's the basic definition for process analysis. So we can use it to tackle any process, any complex action that involves a lot of individual parts and several steps or stages. So, in its simplest form, we can find process analysis in directions. If you've ever put together a piece of furniture or programmed a remote, you've probably had to follow step by step instructions. So, that's kind of getting at what we're talking about here today, but there's really not a lot of analysis in that type of process analysis. It's just a bare bones, step by step, directional thing that's allowing people to follow the steps and achieve the goal or, complete whatever task is at hand. There's a more complex form of process analysis that we are going to be leaning more into that involves not only the steps, but also information and explanation about each step. Sometimes that's not necessary, but for us, it will be. So as we progress through life, we learn a lot of different processes. Some of them are pretty simple, but still quite important. And a lot of these processes involve multiple steps, a particular sequence that we have to learn and get comfortable with. So we learn a lot of these as children, tying your shoes, crossing the street. Later, you learn how to drive a car. That's a process. You learn how to write an English paper. Again, there are multiple steps. That's a process that you have to learn and practice. So again, we're familiar with processes and we generally understand processes and we've learned a lot of them, but now we need to work on sort of operating on the other end. We need to get more proficient at breaking things down and explaining them. So, yeah, we can follow directions, we understand certain processes, but now we need to get comfortable explaining and analyzing processes so that our readers can either complete the series of steps or actions that we're describing or can at least understand in a larger sense our subject of analysis. So remember our basic goals from last week. They are not changing. We are still breaking things down, examining their individual parts in order to understand how the whole thing works. But now we are choosing as our subjects of analysis, we are choosing certain processes or complex actions. And that's what we'll be analyzing over the course of this week and next. So when we're thinking about process analysis, there are kind of two approaches that we can take. The first I've already kind of described. It's called directional process analysis. Basically, it's just instructions. Like I've said, we can find these all over the place, and oftentimes they are very simple and straightforward. So the goal with most directional or directive process analysis is to basically just allow the reader to complete the process or action being described. So the steps are being provided so that the reader or the viewer, if we're watching this, say, in video form, the idea is for us to be able to follow the steps, us as the audience, we can follow the steps and complete that action or complete that particular task. Pretty simple. The name pretty much says it all. Directive. These are directions. The other type is what we call informational or explanatory. So if you look at the two videos I posted in the week 7 module, we see examples of each of these types. So if you watch the coffee video, that's really directional process analysis. They're giving you a step-by-step procedure for sort of manufacturing your own coffee. Now, you would have to grow the coffee like they do on your premises, and you'd have to have all the right equipment, but conceivably, any person, any viewer could follow those steps and complete that process. So they are providing directions for us to follow. So that's directive, pretty straightforward. They do explain each step. So they are providing some additional analysis, but mostly it's designed so we can follow those steps and make our own coffee. So that's an example of directive or directional process analysis. The other video I posted, the Schoolhouse Rock video about how a bill becomes a law, that's more informational, informative, or explanatory, we could consider it, because a regular person watching that isn't necessarily going to be able to complete that process. A regular person who's not serving in Congress or the Senate cannot necessarily complete all of those steps. It's just not possible. But we can be involved. If you watch the video, you'll know that regular people, regular citizens can start the process by proposing a new law and calling their local representative, their local congressperson. So we can get involved, but we can't do it all. So that particular process analysis is geared more towards just allowing us to understand how that larger process works. We're not necessarily expected to do it ourselves. We just are expected to understand, to have a greater understanding of all the individual parts of that process, how they all work together. There's a sequence that we have to learn. And again, there are steps, but they're not necessarily numbering the steps and laying them out in quite the fashion that we see in the coffee video. But there are steps, there are stages, and everything kind of has to go in a particular order. But you'll notice that there's a lot of information given. A lot of things are explained. That's what we need to do. For each step that we're providing in our process analysis, we need to explain how that step works, the relationship between that part or that element and the other parts, the other elements that we're exploring. We have to do more than just provide, simple step-by-step instructions. That is part of what we're doing, either directly or indirectly, but there's more to it. So for us, as we start working on SA2, which will, of course, be the process analysis, we're going to combine these two styles. The explanatory style and the directional or directive style. So we are going to have steps, but we need to sort of analyze and explain each step as we move through our subject of analysis, whatever you happen to choose. So hopefully that makes sense. All of this information is, of course, in the Week 7 overview, so just make sure you go through all of this, make sure you're comfortable with all the terms, and remember, we're not leaving the concepts that we talked about last week. We're still engaged in the same type of work. Remember, last week we saw that we could pretty much analyze anything. I gave you some pictures. I threw out a couple of sort of everyday items like apple pie or a bicycle. But what we were doing, breaking those things down into their individual parts or elements, and then exploring those parts, reassembling them in order to have a better understanding of the overall thing. We're still doing that. But now our subject of analysis will be a process or a complex action. And all the steps, all the parts of that action are going to be the parts or the elements that we explore in our work. And then we're going to be reassembling in order to explain how the whole thing works. So our goals are the same as what we were talking about last week. We're still analyzing, which means we are taking something apart in order to better understand it. And ultimately, our goal is to make our audience understand it. So keep that in mind. So also in the overview, I just included some things that you need to make sure you're doing as we get started on our next essay. So these are things that you need to have in your process analysis. So I'll run through those very quickly, but just I want to throw out another potential subject of analysis that you can just use for practice. So we're going to look at a few more examples this week. Your discussion post will give you a chance to look at a couple of pieces in 50 essays that really are process analyses. You know, one by Frederick Douglass, one by Stephen King. They're not following our model or our structure. Obviously, they're kind of doing their own thing, two very famous writers, but they are describing processes and there are steps. So, you know, those are good examples in written form. And I also would encourage you guys to think a little bit about paper airplanes. I'm actually going to post a video later today. This is Wednesday morning, very early in the morning. I'm going to post a video later on paper airplanes. You don't have to watch it, but this is a simple sort of everyday process that most of us can do, and it might be helpful to try to write down the steps just to get comfortable with this kind of work. So in my live classes, I sort of make the students do this in class. We make paper airplanes. Everybody kind of has their own technique or style. And then once we've kind of figured out how we like to make one, we write down instructions for making it in our particular method or style. And then we give those instructions to a friend or a classmate, and we see if they can follow those instructions easily and if the end result looks right and if they end up with a plane that can actually fly. It's a good way to sort of evaluate the quality of your instructions. Can somebody else follow them and get the desired result? It's kind of fun for those of you who like to do such things. And the video I'm going to post is about this sort of expert paper airplane maker who makes these really impressive airplanes. He's only using paper, but somehow they can go like hundreds of feet, and he sets records and stuff. So, you know, you don't have to watch it. But if you're really interested in paper airplanes, and if you're ambitious and you think you're good at making paper airplanes, you can try to follow along with his process, because he actually shows you in the video. I can't remember the guy's name, but in the video he shows you how to make some of his specialty planes, and it's too complex for me. He's like an origami expert, so he's really good at folding paper. And literally that's all he's doing. He doesn't use any kind of specialized equipment. His planes are just made out of regular like 8x10 or 8x11 paper. But, you know, he kind of walks you through the process. He shows you how to fold the corners and how to make it. So if you guys think you can do some of what he does, you can follow along, you know, pause the video in order to keep up with him and see if you can make one of his planes. It might not be quite as good, but if you can follow his basic design, I bet you can get one that will fly pretty well. But also you might have your own techniques that are effective. So just practice with something like that, you know, something relatively simple, so you can just jot down some quick instructions, but then try to maybe, I know it, you know, for paper airplanes you don't need much explanation, but try to write a sentence or two of explanation for each step. And again, give it to a friend or a family member, see if they can do it, and you'll be able to tell if your instructions are working well. So that's a basic skill we can start practicing now. You know, we're breaking these processes down into steps. The steps, in many cases, are the individual parts or elements that we are exploring. So get comfortable with that kind of work by coming up with your sequence and brief explanations for each step. All right, so let's just talk about some basic things that you need, some features and strategies that you're going to need for Essay 2. So this is all in the Week 7 overview as well. But I want to just say a few words about the thesis, because you will need a thesis statement, a clearly stated thesis in this particular essay. So this is different than the narrative. Remember, with narratives, I told you guys you didn't necessarily have to clearly state your thesis. You needed to have some kind of narrative point or overall purpose, but you could leave it unsaid. Perhaps you remember that. And some of us did leave it unstated, which is fine. But that's because it was a narrative and it was a creative piece, and we didn't want to get too bogged down with rules. but we're not writing narratives anymore. So with the process analysis, you will need a clear thesis in your intro paragraph. And you might not think of the thesis here as necessarily an argument, although you can, but we all have a purpose here, and the purpose is pretty simple. Like I said, I can usually help you with purpose and audience. Two of the things you need to start considering at the very beginning of the writing process as you're getting started on the pre-writing stuff. You always have to consider your audience, which of course is me, but also could be your colleague, your peers, family, friends, but also your purpose. What are you trying to accomplish? So I've already mentioned here, we're trying to explain our process or our action to an audience that probably doesn't know very much about it. So that's the purpose for all of us, regardless of what our individual subjects of analysis might be. But you can also get more specific based on what you yourself are doing, like based on your topic and your approach. And this will become more and more clear as we build our frameworks. But you need to think about it a little bit early on. Like, what am I trying to show? What am I trying to illustrate? What do I need to focus on? What do I want my audience to know, do, understand, think, etc. So we're all going to have some kind of an overarching purpose that we are going to clearly state. And in some cases, it will take the form of an argument. We might be trying to convince our audience that this process is really important, or maybe we need to rethink a particular process. Maybe you're offering an alternative approach or an alternative set of instructions. So you might really have a clear, strong argument. But in other cases, you might simply be sort of performing a more informative function, simply explaining something that matters to people who might not know much about it. But regardless, you got to have a thesis, so we'll start thinking more about that early next week as we get started on Essay 2. Also, you need to start making a list of all the individual parts or elements of your process, of your complex action that you need to discuss, describe, explain. So again, at this early stage, a list is fine, and you might not even cover everything that you write down, but it's good to just start identifying all of the individual parts, all of the important elements that you need to talk about. Identify them first, and then later we can move on to kind of number 3 in this list, which is your organizational structure, your sequence. So just like the narratives, remember I told you guys to come up with your narrative events first, like all the key moments of action, all the big things that are going to happen. I told you to kind of just write those down in rough list form, and then later you could design a sequence or an organizational structure to put those events into. Well, we can kind of follow that same model here. Once you have all your individual parts and elements, you can start figuring out how you're going to arrange them. What order are they going to be presented in? What kind of sequence do you need? So, as we know, a lot of processes have a pre-established sequential order that you have to follow. That's especially true, with like cooking things, or maybe, people have done like sports related process analysis. I read a really good one about hitting a baseball, the actual process that goes into that. So with processes like that, you really do have to go in a certain order. So the sequence is kind of already established, it's already present, so you just need to faithfully sort of record it and explain it. But for other processes, there's no one sequence. Perhaps the thing can be done in several different ways, or maybe you want to encourage your audience to kind of rethink or reject the previously accepted sequence, and you're here to tell us that there's actually a better way to do it. There's a lot of approaches, but just be aware of the sequence that you need to use, whether you're simply following the sequence that already exists or if you're making your own. Okay, so we have to get organized, but we can really start working on that next week as we outline. We can start planning each individual paragraph of our essay and deciding which steps, which elements, which parts we're going to cover in each of our body paragraphs. And of course, we'll also work on our intro and concluding paragraphs. And then finally, you need to provide some help to your audience. And this is something I want you to start considering now before we really get started. So you need to start thinking about your subjects of analysis. What would you like to write about? What would you like to analyze? So once you kind of have a topic in mind, you need to start thinking a little bit more about your audience. What does your audience know? And what does your audience not know? And you need to start thinking about what additional information you can provide. And here's the distinction, the very basic distinction that I want you to make. It's a distinction between common knowledge, which means most people know it, like most American adults probably know it, versus specialized knowledge. And specialized knowledge is different than common knowledge. With specialized knowledge, it's usually unique or specific to a particular field of study or a particular profession or a particular walk of life. You know, it's specific to a particular area. And if people aren't in that area, they probably don't know it. So if you can just make that distinction, you'll be able to understand what needs to be explained and what doesn't. So, you know, typically, if you're talking about like household items, like everyday things that most people are familiar with, you don't really need to explain those items at length. So things like eggs and like mops and brooms, I'm just thinking about like cooking or cleaning, or just like everyday things that are in the house. Like most of your audience members will know what those are. People know what eggs are. People know how to crack eggs. Like those aren't things you have to spend a lot of time explaining. But if you're describing something that's specific to auto mechanics or specific to baseball or specific to a particular field of study or a particular job, that stuff is not common knowledge. Not everybody is going to know that stuff. A lot of people know it, but not everybody. So if you can make the distinction between specialized knowledge and common knowledge, you'll be able to kind of see what you need to explain. And when you're dealing with specialized knowledge, you're going to have to offer definitions. You might need to define certain words that aren't going to be familiar to some of your audience. You'll need to explain things. You'll need to sort of walk us through certain things. You'll need to offer examples in order to kind of make us understand the thing that you're describing, whether it's an individual part or an element, or maybe it's just like a concept, an idea, an accepted piece of knowledge. You might have to sort of compare it to something else and say it's kind of like this other more common thing that maybe you know. That's a way to explain. So that's a lot of the work that you're actually, that some of you will be doing in the body of your essay. As you're walking us through the steps and all the important elements, you're also going to be defining terms, offering examples, and just sort of providing all the explanations and descriptive details that are necessary. I want you guys to remember our descriptive writing lesson, which I believe was week 4. Don't hold me to that. Go back and check in the modules. I think that was week 4 when we talked about description. A lot of those skills will come in handy in your process analysis. Using descriptive language, good verbs, good adjectives, offering a high level of detail, that's going to help your audience to understand whatever it is you're talking about. So again, certain processes that are mostly just involving everyday kind of household items, you might not need as much background info or extra explanation, but any kind of specialized material will require that. And just a final thought before I sign off here, as you're choosing your subjects of analysis, as you're choosing your processes or your actions, try to pick stuff that's relatively complex. I mean, these are 3 to 4 page essays, just like essay 1. So if you pick something that's too simple, like programming a remote, something that we can do in like 2 or 3 really straightforward, easy steps, a process like that is not going to give you enough material to fill up our length requirement. So just keep that in mind. I mean, simple is not bad necessarily, and I've read all kinds of different process analyses. I read a really good one once about cleaning a bathroom, which you wouldn't think is very complicated, but there was a lot that went into it, and that student wrote a very successful analysis. But just remember the analysis part, right? We're not just doing step-by-step instructions. We're also explaining and really sort of breaking everything down. Remember what analysis is. We have to provide this greater understanding of the thing. So if the thing is super easy to understand, if the process is sort of self-explanatory, a child could do it, it takes you just a couple of minutes, then there's not a lot to explain. There's not a larger understanding for your audience to really arrive at. So it's not going to be sufficient. So when you're choosing, try to pick stuff. Again, it's good to pick stuff that you're familiar with, processes that you might do yourself or things that you know. But make sure there's a lot of parts, there's a lot of elements. There doesn't need to be a ton of steps necessarily. You don't need a lot of steps, and you don't even necessarily need to, we're not doing bullet points, we're not doing numbered lists, but you can certainly organize your body paragraphs based on steps, and we'll talk more about that next week. So, again, 3 steps would probably be enough, but as long as you have a lot to say about each one of those steps. So let me know if you're having trouble choosing topics, and let me just briefly mention our schedule for next week. So next week is essay week. We're devoting it to working on essay 2. And I'm actually going to post my week 8 video a little bit earlier in the week. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me to post them on Wednesdays or Tuesdays or Wednesdays, because by that point I kind of already want you guys to be started, working on your essays. So I'm going to post the week 8 video first thing Monday morning, the Monday of week 8, next Monday. So you can watch that early in the week if possible. And I'm going to kind of do something similar to what I did when we were working on Essay 1. I'll give you some of those pre-writing steps to follow, some idea generation, but also let's get organized. I want you guys to start outlining, start thinking about your thesis statement. So I will post a sample outline in the week 8 module that you can use as a guide as you're working. And I'll also we'll kind of cover it in my week 8 lecture. And then what I would like, ideally, you guys are doing some idea generation at the beginning of the week. You have your own outlines by the middle of the week. And then hopefully you have a finished rough draft by the end of the week. And again, you can send me your rough draft if you have it finished by 5 p.m. on Friday of week 8. And then you can use the weekend for post-writing. And of course, Essay 2 is due at the end of week 8. All right, so let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you review all the material in the week 6 overview and the week 7 overview. That's all the analysis stuff that you need. Check out the examples. Let me know if you're having trouble getting started on Essay 2, and I will see you next week.